Road.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Agile Test Management, a Collaborative Approach by Alan Koch. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming PSQT conference in San Diego, California, August 14th through the 19th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. PSQT is the only conference that focuses on practical best practices methods in every aspect of software quality and testing. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To learn more about this exciting conference, visit www.psqtconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer with as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at psqtconference.com. At the end of today's webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Alan Koch. Alan?
Thank you, Eric. Yes, I am Alan Koch, and I'm going to be talking today about managing the test process in Agile projects. Very interesting topic here because when you look at the Agile methods, it leaves a lot of questions to be answered. So to get started with this discussion, I first want to talk about what management is in the Agile methods, because management is actually done a bit differently than what you see in more traditional project management methodologies. The key thing is what we see here on the screen, self-organizing teams, or another term you might think of is self-managing teams. The traditional concept of command and control management is really foreign to the Agile approach. And so really need to think about what we mean here when we say managing the test process. It really is a matter not so much of a command and control type of manager talking about keeping control of things, but it is this team self-managing, self-organizing, coming up with their own plans, tracking their own status, working together on the project. And so all the things that you see listed here are all things that this self-managing team would be organizing. So what does that mean for testers? Well, if you're talking about a test manager, that would then fall to whoever is responsible on this particular Agile team for testing. Testers on an Agile team would simply operate as anyone else on an Agile team would operate, and that is participating in all of these self-organizing type of activities. The requirements, the planning, the status tracking, corrective action, all of these things are things that the testers would be very much involved with along with their peers, the other members of this self-organizing team. So that's the context that I want to set for you here. That doesn't mean there's no role for traditional managers. Obviously, functional units have to have managers, and you have a lot of activities that a functional unit manager would be doing. But in an Agile approach, one of the things the functional unit managers are not doing is managing the activities on the individual projects. They, of course, are interested stakeholders in the projects, but they're not taking a very traditional kind of a role towards management. So that's the context. So who are these people on an Agile team? So for those of us who are not that familiar with it, Agile teams are essentially made up of these groups of people here. So first, on the left-hand side, we see the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is about as close as you get to having any kind of a manager role on an Agile team, but that person is generally not thought of as a manager. It's usually thought of more as a coach or a leader. The term you often hear used is a servant leader, as in the person is there to serve the team, not to command the team. And as you can see, the main thing that this person is thinking about is how effective the team is going to be. The only other special role that you see on the team is on the right-hand side here with the product owner. This is the customer, the person who can tell us precisely what it is that we should be building. And of course, that person is very focused on what is it that we're building. When you talk about the rest of the team, it literally is everybody else. And it's made up of all of the disciplines that would be necessary in order for us to build the right product, to do the right things, and to self-manage appropriately. So where's tester? The tester is simply a member of the team. And so tester is managing the testing that's going on the team just as much as the UI designer is managing database work on the team, and all of the other specialists are managing the work that's going on in the team. The tester, as a member of an self-organizing team, then is doing that. So let's talk about how the planning happens. So in an Agile project, this self-managing team, of course, is doing planning. Planning is a very, very important part of the Agile process. And in fact, Agile teams tend to spend more time in planning activities than you see going on traditional project teams. The terms that you see here, it's iterative and incremental planning. And what that means is the iterative is referring to the fact that you're doing these planning activities over and over and over again. Agile development is done in iterative cycles. Every cycle begins with planning activities. And so the Agile planning is indeed going on throughout the entire project as the project team is doing each iteration. And then the other word we have here is incremental. And what we mean by that is the idea that the plan builds up a little bit at a time. The team starts off with a rough, high-level plan for what's going to go on the project, but it's only a rough plan. And then as you are doing the iterative planning, as the team is moving forward with the sprints, then the detailed plans for the sprints are then incrementally building out the details in the plan. Very different from traditional planning where we have a very, very detailed plan up front. In an Agile approach, we're building the details into the plan a little bit at a time. So what does that mean for test planning? Well, that is simply a matter of testing is simply one of the sets of activities that is being planned. So when you talk about the team doing this rough high-level plan, that includes the rough high-level plan for testing. How are we going to test? What are our quality objectives? What are our testing objectives? Who should be responsible for what? How are things going to play out? How do we know when we're ready to test? All of those kinds of high-level test planning kinds of things would go on. And then, of course, at the beginning of every sprint, the detailed sprint planning would include, along with everything else, precisely what testing is going to happen. What are all the testing activities? Who needs to build what scripts and what testing has to go on and who's doing it and how are we managing defects and all of those things. So the test planning is going on in this same iterative and incremental mode as as all the other activities and plans that are going on the project. Again, we don't have a big test plan that we build and put together in complete form before we start testing. The testing work goes on just like everything else, based on this iterative planning process and incrementally building up the plans. So here's a picture of the Agile life cycle as I like to talk about it here. This is indeed a generic picture that I've built based on my work with lots of different Agile methods. Scrum, of course, is one of the most popular Agile methods, but then there's many others. So you have kickoff, the project gets kicked off and initiated, and that's where that high-level planning goes that I was talking about. The high-level planning is done at that point, and then of course the loop here represents the sprints, the iterative approach here, and as you can see, every sprint starts with planning, and then of course we spend our time developing the work, and then there's a review at the end and adapting to change, where we adapt to whatever surprises might be coming up in the project here. Agile planning, of course, fits in just those ways. The high-level strategy and planning at the beginning, the detailed level planning during that sprint planning session, and then there's also a third level that we talk about, which is the daily task planning. Daily planning is unique to the Agile methods. In traditional methods, we tend not to see this at all. There's very few cases of a daily planning activity. But in the Agile world, because we're talking about the team being a self-organizing team, you really need to have this daily coordination or daily syncing up, or however you want to think about it, that really drives what's going on as the team is going forward. So this daily task plan is going on. And then, of course, adapting to change, because if you have any surprises that come up, if the product owner changes some requirements, any of those kinds of things, then of course we need to adapt the high-level plans and make whatever adjustments we need to happen. So as you can see, Agile planning, this whole idea of the iterative and incremental kind of an approach to it, Agile planning is built into the Agile process. And so that's just how things tend to work. Now, when you talk about Agile test planning, it is precisely that. At the beginning of the project, we're doing a high-level test strategy and a high-level test plan. And as I alluded to earlier, it's not getting into the details of precise, exactly what test cases we're going to have and all of those kinds of things, but it's the high-level planning of how are we going about this and what are our objectives and those sorts of things. The detailed test planning happens at the beginning of every sprint, and this is where we actually are talking task planning here. What tests have to be created, what scripts have to be written, who's doing testing, all of those kinds of details then are happening at this iteration planning point in the process. And as the work is going forward, a lot of times we tend to think of test planning as being writing the test cases. That's actually test planning type activities that are actually going on as just part of the work. In general, on an Agile project, the test cases are being written on a just-in-time basis. The reason for that, of course, is because that's actually one of the principles that the Agile methods are built on, is doing work just in time. And so within each sprint, we're building certain functionality. We would also be building the test cases that are needed to test that functionality. And so the actual writing of the test cases tends to be done within the sprint, not prior to them. Although testers will sometimes work kind of one sprint ahead, be preparing the tests. That is sometimes a mode of operation for some testers. But in general, it's happening as part of the work for the sprints. And of course, the tester is participating in the daily plan. So as the work is moving forward in the sprint, we're keeping the testing activities on track along with all of the other activities that are going on in the sprint by collaborating with our team members and checking status and making sure that we know precisely how we're moving forward. And of course, if there are changes on the project, then the tester is part of what the team is doing as far as adapting to whatever those changes might happen to be. And of course, our high-level test strategy is probably not going to be affected by these changes terribly much, but whatever adjustments need to happen, definitely we would want to account for them. All right, so that's a look at how test planning gets done in an Agile method. We're going to go on and talk about status tracking and some other things here, but at this point here, I just want to remind you that we have the question panel available to you, so if you have any questions about the planning side of testing, definitely make sure you get those into the question window so I can get those answered at the end of the webinar here. All right, so with that being said, let's talk about status tracking, because that's another big part of what goes on when you start talking about test management. Well, we need to stay on top of the status of what's going on. So first, let's talk in general about how Agile teams do status tracking. And it boils down to regular status checking and corrective action. That's not too terribly different from what you see in traditional methodologies. There's usually some kind of a regular status check. And so this is not terribly different. About the only thing that's different is how often status gets checked. And as you see here with this first sub-bullet, on an Agile team, it's actually a daily check. I have seen a few cases in traditional projects where we do daily checks, do a daily stand-up of one kind or another, but they tend to be pretty rare. On Agile teams, this is the normal mode of operation. The daily scrum is not just for planning, it really is also a status check opportunity. And indeed, the work that goes on in that daily scrum, which is a very short meeting, obviously if it happens every day, is not just status it's not just status checking, but it's also, of course, then identifying if corrective action needs to be taken. The team, of course, as a self-organizing team, would determine when things are not going as they should be going, and it would be a matter of the team working together to figure out how to get the work back on track so you can successfully finish what you're doing in the sprint. And that includes the testing work. This is one of the things that can happen a lot of times on Agile teams, or on any team, but it definitely can happen on Agile teams, where maybe the other work is going along fine, but the testing work may not be going along. And so, yeah, the whole team together would collaborate to figure out how can we get testing back on track if that's what's not on track. So this is unique, the fact that the whole team is concerned with the status of testing. And this is because in Agile teams, testing tends to be an activity that everyone is paying attention to. At least, let me put it this way, at least on healthy Agile teams, testing is an activity that everyone is paying attention to. And so if testing is not going as well as it should during a sprint, then everyone is concerned about it and everyone is going to be collaborating on figuring out what to do about it. And indeed, corrective action when testing is not going as it should, sometimes it means other people, who knows who, are rolling up their sleeves and participating in the testing to help to get it done. So the daily scrum is a hugely important part of the status checking activities. The other big part of status checking happens at the end of every sprint. And sprints tend to be very, very short. They're usually only a few weeks, and in fact, the industry has been moving towards shorter sprints. I've been involved with Agile work for over 10 years now, and 10, 12 years ago, it was probably the most common length for a sprint was about 4 weeks. Today, the most common length for a sprint is 2 weeks. And so we've been moving towards shorter and shorter sprints, which one of the values you get out of having these short sprints is you get to check status and get these sprint reviews more often. Because the sprint review becomes a very important status activity. And the sprint review, the team is actually delivering a little bit of functionality for the product owner to accept. It's a milestone event, essentially, because you have software being delivered and accepted by the customer. And so having these sprint review events happening on a regular basis is the other big part of Agile status tracking. And it, of course, has a different focus. The daily scrum is essentially tracking to see if we're going to get to the end of the sprint and successfully finish what we were doing in the sprint. During the sprint reviews, we're looking at what did we accomplish so far in the project, and of course look forward to what's going to be happening for the rest of the project, and identifying if the project is moving forward appropriately. So that's how Agile teams go about doing status tracking. And of course, as I've just been talking about as we've been going through here, the tester is simply part of it. And the testing activities are simply part of what the team is talking about. And so there's really nothing special when it comes to tracking the status of testing activities and taking corrective action on testing activities. It is simply part of the discussions that go on. So regular status tracking, just to reiterate, the daily scrum is the status tracking mechanism to help us to know that we're getting through the scrum or through the sprint appropriately. And of course, the review at the end of every sprint is essentially a delivery milestone that allows the team to know how they're progressing and allows the product owner to essentially say, yes, you're moving in the right direction or not. So when you talk about test status checking, it's just testing activities are part of what we're talking about. And the key thing from a testing perspective that's happening at that iteration review is this customer acceptance. And the tester being involved in these discussions that go on during customer acceptance is a very, very important part of the process. Because in reality, what you have is the customer is now giving feedback to the team. And obviously, you would want the feedback to simply say, I love it, keep going, right? But the reality is the feedback is often much more nuanced. And the product owner saying, I like a lot of this, there's a little bit here I don't like, and this isn't going the right way, and this is really wonderful, I hadn't thought about that, keep doing that. You start getting a lot of very interesting feedback from the product owner during these reviews. And the tester then, this is the opportunity for the whole team, tester included, to become more and more conversant with precisely what does it mean for this product to really satisfy what the customer needs. And so this customer acceptance type of activity that's happening at the end of every sprint is a very, very important part of that. So that's the Agile testing, status tracking, and corrective action types of things that are going on. All right, I am seeing a lot of people talking about audio problems in fact, those are the only questions I'm seeing here.
There's no audio on the problems on my end, Alan. I think a little bit earlier we had a little issue, but you're fine now.
Okay. All right. Good. Wow. I'm sorry about that. If there's any specific part of this that you were not able to hear me clearly on, then please do ask questions about those things. I am sorry about that. I don't know why that's happening. All right, so let's move on then to the next topic that we have here, workload management. And this is a big deal because obviously on any project, sometimes things don't move as they should, and sometimes there's more work for one discipline to do and less work for another. There's all kind of workload management that goes on, and most traditional managers are very much involved in workload management. On an Agile team, this is one of the things that the self-organizing team is really focused on. And this is why we use the term self-organizing team. The word organizing is referring to the fact that the team is really figuring out how they should actually work together. I've been talking about collaboration here a lot, and a big part of that collaboration is indeed the team figuring out how they can be most effective in how they do this collaboration. The daily scrum is a very, very important part of that collaboration. Every single day, the team members getting together and saying, this is how it's going, and am I having any problems, and what's going on, and those sorts of things. But in addition to the daily scrum, we expect that the team members are actually interacting with each other and talking with each other on a regular, continual basis. The Agile methods actually suggest that the best mode for an Agile team to work in is to be co-located. I mean, everybody together in the same location so they can be just talking with each other constantly. And this is the reason why that is a recommendation, is because this continual interaction is one of the most important pieces in the team being able to self-organize and really effectively collaborate with each other. Now, what we found over the years is that you don't have to be co-located in order to effectively operate as an Agile team. There's lots of electronic communication mechanisms we have available to us that we can use for having this continual interaction going on. But the bottom line on it is that the continual interaction does indeed need to be happening in one form or another, and that's how the team shares the workload. And the bottom line, as the second bullet is getting to, is people pitch in. This is one of the interesting things on an Agile team. Although our Agile teams, for the most part, tend to be made up of specialists, not only are there testers on the team, there are designers, there are database people, there are security people, whatever disciplines, specialties might be needed. But on Agile teams that work really effectively, what you see is people reaching across those specialty boundaries and helping each other as needed. And this is the concept behind this is something that we refer to as T-shaped professionals. And what we mean by T-shaped professionals is essentially everybody has a specialty. And this tends to be true on our project teams. Everyone has a specialty, and in that specialty, specialties tend to be relatively narrow, and the person's knowledge in that specialty, if we're going to call that person a specialist, is very, very deep. So when you think about the shape of a capital letter T, that's the vertical bar on the T, is that narrow but deep bit of knowledge that every one of our professionals brings to the table. Well, on an Agile project, we're looking for T-shaped professionals, and what we mean by that is not only does the person have this single area of deep knowledge, but they also have at least a marginal competence with many other things as well. And so that's the crossbar across the top of the T. So every one of my specialists is on the team because they are a specialist in some particular area and will be contributing to the team's success with their specialty. But the other way that they contribute to the team's success is by doing things that are outside of their specialty just to support the other team members whenever that's the best use of their time. So that's the idea behind team members helping each other as needed, literally reaching across the specialty boundaries. So when you talk about test workload management, this principle comes into play. When testing starts becoming a bottleneck for the activities that are going on, then the other team members need to be stepping up and actually participating in the testing activities. So all team members might be testing at any particular point in time. Now the tester, as the specialist in testing, would of course be overseeing, coordinating. Usually the tester is the one coming up with the test strategies and those sorts of things. But the reality is that pretty much anybody can have testing as one of those things that they're competent at doing, especially if someone like a tester has actually told them, okay, this is what you need to do, here's the strategy, here are the test cases. It's just a matter of doing the testing. So that's the idea here, is everyone on an Agile team is likely to be doing testing. And in fact, on most Agile teams, what you see is the need for everyone to be involved in testing. Most Agile teams have one tester on them. And obviously with however many other members of the team that there are, one tester can't do all the testing. That just simply is not even a reasonable thought. And so it's just a natural thing for everyone else on the project team to be involved in testing. Now this raises an interesting question in many people's minds, the idea of separation of duties. Right? Do I really want Joe Programmer testing the code that he wrote? And the answer to that is yes and no. So the yes side of it is, yes, Joe Programmer should be testing his code. Every programmer should see testing as simply part of what he or she is responsible for. And the mantra that you want to see on an Agile project for any of the programmers is that a programmer is not going to hand something off to a peer or to the tester or to anyone else on the project team for testing or verification until he or she believes it is correct and completely right. So that means that programmers really should be doing a significant amount of testing of their own work. But you generally also want to see kind of an independent test of it. And what we can do, though, with this workload management here, this handing off of work, is essentially the tester, again, acting as a coordinator and overseer, but maybe having one person, one programmer, test a different programmer's work. So you have this cross-testing. That satisfies the need for separation of duties, and it gives us a way to make sure that a lot of good testing gets done in spite of only possibly having one tester on the project. So this is a good mode of operation. And I've actually found a very interesting dynamic taking place when you start doing this. Programmers tend to be a bit competitive. And that competitiveness comes out when you start having them test each other's code. It's almost laughable, it's almost funny, but it's actually very, very effective from a testing standpoint. When you have, Joe and Susan are each writing code, and then they give each other, okay, now Susan tests Joe's code and Joe tests Susan's code. There's a little competition that gets set up. Essentially, each of them thinking, gee, can I find more problems with that person's code than they find with mine? And the competition aspect of it actually turns into really, really effective testing. It's kind of funny, but it works really well. It's just amazing how well it can work. So that's how we manage this sharing of the load when it comes to testing activities. Now, not all Agile teams are in that mode that I mentioned where, only one tester with several, other people on the team. Sometimes you do have 2 or 3 testers on an Agile team, and obviously that would mean that the testers themselves could do more of the testing workload. But I need to point out that even in that kind of situation, we still expect the developers are doing an effective job of testing their own work before they ever hand it off to anyone else. That's actually a principle in the Agile methods. Everyone has this responsibility towards quality. Everyone needs to have this idea that I can't say I'm done with something until I'm sure it's done right. And so even if I have sufficient testers on the project to take care of all the testing, that does not relieve the development team, the developers, of the need to do effective and complete testing. All right, so that's our, whoops, let me go back. So that's our look at workload management on an Agile team. And as I said earlier, this is kind of a hallmark of the Agile methods, this self-organizing team kind of sharing the load with each other. So if any of you have any questions on sharing the load on working or on testing, then definitely throw them in the chat window. All right, next topic we have here is process improvement. Now, a lot of us don't think of process improvement as one of the things that we're paying attention to when we are managing projects, but indeed we should be. That actually is a missing element in the way a lot of projects are managed. The reality is that keeping your eye on how effective are we being and how could we be more effective is something that always should be part of managing work on any project at all. The Agile methods have actually done a good job of making this a normal part of the management that this self-organizing team does. And the way they do it is the retrospectives at the end of every sprint. Now, the term retrospective is relatively unique to the Agile methods. I haven't run into it being used in very many other places. But it's essentially the same thing as what most of us call lessons learned, right? We get done with something and then we have to go, well, what could we learn from having done this? After the project is over. If it gets done at all. It gets done after the project is over. And by then, it's like too late for the project to benefit from it. And in fact, many organizations don't bother doing it because they don't see a lot of value. And it's like, okay, so we get together and have this meeting. What does that do for us? Well, the Agile methods do these retrospectives not at the end of the project. They do them regularly. Most Agile teams do them at the end of every sprint. But even if they don't do them at the end of every sprint, the Agile teams that do them, which is most Agile teams, do them on some regular basis. And of course, they're talking literally what's going well, what's not going well, and then the key point is this third thing. And what should we do differently starting tomorrow? And that's what's cool about the whole Agile retrospective approach, is that because it's being done within the project, if we see something that we can do better or something we should change about how we operate, we can do it, and the rest of the time on the project can benefit from that change. As a person who's been involved in process improvement work for decades now, this is very, very exciting to me, because this is the opportunity to do true continuous process improvement. And indeed, what I've seen on many Agile teams is they do a really, really good job of continual process improvement. So that's how Agile projects handle process improvement. So how do we improve our testing process? Again, it's just part of it. You know, when we get to these retrospectives at the end of each sprint, one of the things that the Agile team members, or that the tester, I would hope, is doing is really looking at the testing that's going on and saying, so what's working well with our testing and what's not working well with our testing, and making suggestions to the team about how we can change how we're doing our testing in the very next sprint so that we can actually be better at it. And of course, as a tester, we're going to be looking not just at the mechanics of who's doing what and the coordination and that kind of thing, but also how effective is the testing. You know, are we actually catching the defects, or are defects slipping through and escaping, right? And so this gives us an opportunity as testers to help the whole team, not just ourselves, but the whole team, to get better and better at testing. And this is a really cool thing when you stop and think about it, the idea that we as a team, not just testers, but the whole team, the developers, the designers, the DBA, everybody on the team can start getting better and better at testing. It's just an exciting proposition. At least I think it is. So when you talk about Agile process improvement, that's really when the retrospectives tend to happen. It's part of the sprint review that you have at the end of sprints. Like I said, many Agile teams do it at the end of every single sprint. Some of them don't do it every time, but they still will do it at the end of a sprint when they do it. So that tends to be it. So test process improvement is just part of that. All right, so that's really our look at process improvement and how we can be improving our testing process. So if you have any questions on that particular topic, then go ahead and throw those in the question window as well. Okay, so that actually got us through all of the angles that I had prepared for this. This is a topic that actually has become a big topic. A lot of my consulting and my training actually over the last, 2, 3, 4 years now has been around this idea of testing on Agile projects. One of the things that we found is because the Agile books tend to be pretty silent on the subject of testers, that there was a lot of confusion, a lot of question marks in people's minds about testing very early on. And so over the last, I would say 5 years or so, there's been a concerted effort by the Agile community to really work this out. And I think we've gotten to the point now where we have some really good best practices that have been worked out. I have no doubt that we will continue to improve our understanding of how testers can best work on Agile projects as we move forward. But I think we've gotten to a point now where we really have a pretty good handle on it. So I'm looking forward to testers becoming a more and more vital part of Agile projects. All right, so that gets me through the materials here. Now I want to go ahead and address some of the questions that you folks have thrown into the question window. So let me do a bit of a scroll here and see what we have here, get past those audio issues. Okay, so so I have one question here from someone who's asking, what if something comes up in the middle of a sprint? Generally, when a team is working on a sprint, like I said, they're very short time periods. The most common sprint these days is only 2 weeks, but things do happen. And that is indeed something that an Agile team always needs to be aware of. So there's 2 answers to what happens if something comes up in the middle of a sprint. The first one is the rule. Of course, rules are made to be broken. That's why there's a second thing I need to say. But first, the rule. The rule is that if at all possible, we want to simply keep our nose to the grindstone and finish the sprint and then address whatever came up. And what we find is because the Agile sprints are so short, we can often do that. So, I mean, think about it. If you're doing 2-week sprints, then on average, if something comes up, it's going to be, we're only 1 week away from the end of the sprint. And so let's just finish what we're doing and then we can address it. And many things can wait a few more days for us to address them. So that's one answer. But the second answer is sometimes they can't wait, and so we have to do something about it. This is where the self-organizing team becomes very, very important, because it's a matter of the team is going to have to stop and sit down around the table and say, what do we do about this? What's the best way to handle this? And sometimes it's going to be to change their plan and change what they had planned on working on in the sprint and address whatever this is that came up as part of the sprint. It might be, and this is something teams don't do very often, but it might be, well, let's just abort the sprint and take care of whatever we need to take care of here, and then we'll start over again, a week or 2 later. Teams don't abort very often. Nobody likes to do that. But the bottom line is that as a self-organizing team, they will simply sit down and figure out what's the best way to deal with it. So, and things coming up in the middle of the sprint, I mean, that can cover a lot of ground, but really it doesn't matter what comes up. Whether we lose people, whether some manager changed their mind, the customer changes their mind on something, I don't care what it is that could come up in the middle of a sprint. That's how the team would handle it, is consciously sit down with each other and say, okay, what are we going to do? What's the best way to handle this? And I think one of the important things to bear in mind, remember the composition of the team that I touched on at the very beginning. The team is made up of the Scrum Master, who is essentially trying to guide the team towards being as effective as they can be, but it also includes the product owner. And so when you're doing these, what's the best thing for us to do? The product owner is one of the voices at the table. Because if, for instance, if the product owner changed their mind on what needed to be delivered, then obviously, if I was a product owner, I would object very strenuously if the team wanted to just keep building what I didn't want anymore. So, they're part of that discussion. This is one of the things that people sometimes lose sight of. On an Agile team, it's not the developers just self-managing. It is the Agile team self-managing, and that includes the product owner. All right. Let's see here. So, okay, same person. What happens if something happens? Do we change the plan in the middle of the sprint? All right, and so essentially, as I said, we don't want to. The rule of thumb is just finish what you're working on, but sometimes it is what the team realizes is going to be the smart thing to do. All right, so I have another question here. How do you recommend tracking results? That's a really good question. I actually didn't address that directly in this webinar here. Agile teams track all the work that they're doing as part of what they need to do as a self-organizing team that's actually managing themselves. But there's lots of different ways that different Agile teams go about doing it. The only common thing that you see is the teams, of course, are working story by story, and they often keep track of their status against their stories, using something like a burn down chart or something like that. But there's lots of detailed work that Agile teams need to keep track of. And so when you're talking about tracking test results, and actually, right, okay, he's asking how do you track test results when other team members are doing the testing. And this is, okay, so this is specifically aimed at the situation I was talking about where the tester is not the only one doing the testing. Well, it's like any other kind of situation here where anyone doing testing needs to be reporting the results of what they test, not just the defects. Obviously, any defects would have to be, reported and handled and that sort of thing, but also the status of what they're doing. So when I said that the tester was probably going to be kind of doing an organizational thing, organizing and guiding the work that people are doing if other people are doing the testing, then these people would be talking with and emailing and whatever the appropriate interaction mechanism. If you're co-located, it's probably talking with the tester about it. The tester is probably going to be keeping track of status using some kind of a spreadsheet. Sometimes testers use things like burn down charts to actually burn down test cases, to keep track of how many test cases have been run and how many test cases haven't been run yet. There's lots of different mechanisms like that different people tend to use. On Agile teams, there isn't really a single way that I've seen that they keep track of stuff. Well, actually, and let me say this, it is actually pretty common on Agile teams to use very, very standard tools for managing this stuff, like Quality Center, which is now no longer called Quality Center, ALM. That is such a common tool on Agile projects. So it's like, okay, so all of my tests are in ALM, and then I am going to keep track of the status of them. So if Joe Programmer is running a bunch of tests, then when he tells me he's done with them, I'll check what he did, and then I'll update ALM to show that those tests have been run. So that, that's the kind of mechanism that's usually going on. Again, this idea of the team talking to each other almost continually is kind of the heart of it. Let's see here. Pam, I'm sorry, I guess I don't need to say who, but question here, what's the best way to keep sprint retrospectives positive? And this is always a danger when you're talking about lessons learned. People sometimes go very, very negative on you. This is something that generally the Scrum Master is usually the person who's facilitating this kind of a discussion. Scrum Masters need to have really good facilitation skills. And in fact, I always recommend that if you're going to be a Scrum Master, that you get facilitation skills training, because these things will happen. People will turn negative, and the person who's facilitating the meeting needs to cut that off immediately. Obviously, doing a retrospective, there's brainstorming involved, there's open discussion involved, and if somebody turns negative on you, it'll shut down in a minute. So it really takes very, very careful facilitation skills. Literally, the term that we use in meeting facilitation is shut down. Essentially, if somebody turns negative, then the facilitator has to shut that person down immediately. And the shutting, it's almost a public, well, it is a public shutting down, has two purposes. One is to stop the negative comments, but the second purpose is so that everybody else on the team sees that negative comments are not going to be tolerated. So yeah, it's a hard thing to deal with, and it really is up to the facilitator, which on an Agile team is the Scrum Master, to stay on top of that. Yeah, if it goes negative, we're in trouble. Okay, so question, does Agile work with root cause analysis on the fly, because perhaps also encompassing distributed teams and requirement-based stakeholders? Wow, there's a lot in that question here. The bottom line, the Agile methods don't explicitly talk about doing root cause analysis, but by the same token, what they do talk about is if there's things going wrong, if the team is running into issues, the rule of thumb is we stop working and sit down around the table and figure it out. So although they don't use the term root cause analysis, that's the intention of the team, just stop working, sit down, figure this out, is to get to the root and figure out what to do about the root. Now you ask about encompassing distributed team members, requirement-based stakeholder. I'm not sure what you mean by requirement-based stakeholders, but distributed team members, if you are working on a distributed Agile team, those people who are remote still need to be included in all of these discussions. Agile teams with distributed that are distributed or that have a few people who are not co-located with everybody else generally are making very, very good use of technology to keep everybody in the loop, to keep everybody part of the discussions. If we're going to sit down and have a meeting, then we're going to fire up Citrix or WebEx or something like that and include the remote people in the discussions that we have. The status tracking is done using some kind of a tool so that everybody, including the people who are remote, can see precisely what's going on. Our daily scrums are usually done by teleconference, so everybody can hear what's going on. So the technology is the way to keep the distributed members of the team involved, and that would include in root cause analysis for issues. If we're going to call an impromptu meeting, it's going to be using Citrix or WebEx or something like that. Okay, question regarding test planning. When should the detailed requirements be fleshed out? When I've done Agile, it seems that the detailed requirements are being fleshed out during the sprint, so testers and developers are waiting on input. However, if the requirements are done a sprint early, it's difficult to find time for the product owner to help with the current sprint. Yeah, this is actually one of the things that's done differently on different Agile teams. It is the timing part of it is really difficult because on most, the expectation, let's put it this way, the expectation is that the final details are being worked out in the sprint. You work out whatever details you need to that are necessary to plan the sprint, but that's not all the details. If I have a report is one of the user stories that we're going to do, then the report layout and precise computations are being done and all of those kind of things are usually worked out in the sprint. So the key with doing this kind of stuff in the sprint and not having it end up being a bottleneck is essentially for all of the team members who are affected by that particular user story to actually be included in the discussion. Whatever meeting with the product owner would include the developer or developers, if there's more than one, who are going to write that story. The tester would be sitting there with them, and all of the gory details of what's needed would then be captured. And one of the really effective ways of doing that is for the tester to actually capture the details that the product owner articulates in the form of test cases. The reason why that's a really effective way is because first off, it gets our leg up on actually producing the tests that we need to do, but it also makes it a very usable format for the developers too, because if the developers know precisely what the tests are going to look like, they will write to the tests, and as long as that captures precisely what the product owner wants, it's a good way to do it. So working out the dynamics of how that information gets captured, when the discussions happen, it is different on different Agile teams, just as your experience says. It's a dynamic that the team just basically has to figure out what's going to work for them. There isn't a single way that works for all teams, at least not that I've ever seen. Okay, so specific question, what is a test manager's role in Agile? And I touched on this a little bit at the beginning. When you talk about test manager, I'm thinking in terms of a functional team of testers. And so when you think about a manager of a functional group of testers, obviously you have, having the right people in the testing department, the training, getting people assigned to the right projects. I mean, there's a whole lot of basic functional manager things that would be going on there. The one thing that a test manager would not be doing is actually doing the day-to-day planning of what are testers doing on a project, because that's part of the self-managing team thing. Now, so that's one answer to it. Another answer to it, though, is if my Agile teams are actually constituted with several testers, then one of the testers on that Agile team might be called the manager. The kind of the lead tester would actually be the term you'd more likely see on an Agile team. And in that case, it would be a very traditional lead tester kind of a role, coordinating the work of all the testers. And of course, I would add to that coordinating work not just of the testers, but of everybody who's doing testing, which is pretty much everybody on the project. So depending on which you meant, that is actually the type of role that a test manager would have. In Agile projects, you tend not to see the name manager. Okay, I'm a little confused. The developer will do the code, and also will he test it? Will someone else test it again? At the end, developers also test. And I guess the answer to that is yes, yes, and yes. A developer should always fully test his or her code, but it should also be tested by someone else. And the tester might be the someone else who's testing it, but if we're sharing the workload, it might be another developer that's testing it. But yes, somebody else does need to verify it. It's one of those things where most people just don't do an excellent job of testing their own work just because they have blinders on, is really what it comes down to. Even with the best of intentions, it's always really, really important to get somebody else to also test a person's work. But it could be another developer. That can work very well. In the end, yes, developers also test. And I'm not sure what you mean by at the end, because in a lot of ways, if we're doing testing, maybe a testing sprint at the end or something like that, yes, the developers would be very much involved in testing and those kinds of things. There is a concept of, Scrum calls it the stabilization sprint. Many of the Agile methods refer to it as the hardening sprint. A lot of Agile teams call it the hardening sprint, but those sprints are all about testing, and the expectation is everyone rolls up their sleeves and tests. And the only person who might not be testing is a developer who has to fix something. Somebody found a bug and he or she has to go and fix something real quick, but then once they get it fixed, then they're back and testing. So in those end stage testing phases, everyone is testing. That's actually the expectation with those. Does the Agile methodology need an SQA manager role? I definitely would say that is an important role, again, from an oversight over all the projects, auditing, process checking. Those things are still valuable. So I definitely would still say that's a valuable role. Boy, I've got a lot more questions here, and I only have a couple minutes left. I'm going to hit a couple more of these, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get them all. Currently working on an Agile project, the product owners and stakeholders are constantly adding on. At what point can we say enough? All right, this is, you're experiencing a little bit of dysfunction. The product owner should be operating as a member of the team, and the piling on, essentially when anything gets added to the list of what the team needs to do, the product owner needs to be part of the discussion about, well, how do we make this fit? The product owner can't just keep piling things onto the team. And in fact, the product owner should be the team's advocate with all of the other stakeholders. And the product owner needs to prioritize and say, look, this is important enough, we have to figure out how to make it fit, and then work with the team to figure out how to make it fit. And the product owner should also be the person saying, this isn't important enough, we don't have time for it. So the product owner being one of the people piling on is a dysfunction, and it's not uncommon. I do run into it, but that's the product owner not doing their job correctly. All right, I am at the end of my time here. Eric, let me hand it back to you. Is there a way we can get answers to the rest of these questions to everybody?
Yes, we can certainly answer these questions. If you do have some time, we can certainly go. Otherwise, we can, we have the email addresses for the questions that we can send to the students, and then also we can put them on our Twitter page as well.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do that then. I will then go through these questions and write up answers to them. We can just get them out to you folks and then post them. That'd be great.
Wonderful. Well, I would like to thank you, Alan, for your time, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar, sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can also follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.